India-Singapore dialogue. And the one thing which came across very clearly there is the fact that the two countries have always had very good and stable relations. There were many references to the interests which the late Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew took in India. There was great appreciation from their side of the fact that India declared a day's mourning on his passing, as also the fact that the Prime Minister of India was there at the funeral. The theme of our afternoon is really now what next? Where do we go from here? India now is in a policy environment which is much more, which is basically opening up both in economic terms as well as in political strategic terms. It's also the growing importance of the Look-East policy, the shift of the locus of gravity of the world economy to the Asia-Pacific. So in a sense, the road ahead could possibly be significantly more interesting and certainly very different from the road that we have traveled so far. So this is the question that I will pose to the four panelists that we have, that in the light of the changed circumstances of the world, power structure of the world economy, in the light of the sort of changing environment in India on how to deal with the outside world, how do you see this relationship progressing? We have four very distinguished panelists, starting with my right, Mr. Jamshed Godrej, who is the chair of Godrej and Boyce and a very active player in many areas in India, including the CII, the Aspen Institute, and a variety of environmental organizations. I'm very fortunate that I work with him in several of them, and it's a pleasure for me to be here. Next to him is Mr. Tommy Koh, who's the chair of the Singapore side. Again, a friend from, I don't normally say, an old friend. I say a friend of long standing. And so we were together during the Rio conference in 1990 to 92, so knew each other 25 years ago. Next to him is Mr. Gopinath Pillai, who is again a doyen of both of the business side in Singapore as well as the foreign policy side, and a great supporter. You have much of the details in the things which have been given to you. And Raja Menon, who is of course, Mohan. Wrong strategic analysis, Raja Mohan. And he is, of course, very well known to all of us as a well-known strategic analyst, and has also had a connection with Singapore for quite some time. So let me begin first with Jamshed Godrej.
Thank you, Nitin. And ladies and gentlemen, I think that the most important aspect of Singapore is essentially the fact of geography, which is it is located in a place which is so critical for both the trade, marine trade, as well as the gateway to Asia, Southeast Asia, and China. And I think that for India to take advantage of that very, very strategic position of Singapore is really very important for us as we move our focus, which has mostly been on the West, to more towards the East. And I can tell you that when we started our businesses in Malaysia and Singapore, at that time, it was the development levels were between India and Malaysia at that time was very, very different from what it is today. And we were actually able to go and invest and do things there. Whereas today, the really interesting things for us is not so much Singapore, but how do you use Singapore to go to Vietnam, to go to Cambodia, to go to Laos? So I think business is really looking now at a very different way of how Singapore will assist. Singapore, because of its financial strength, because of its infrastructure strength, is a huge, and for its stable government and legal basis, is a huge benefit for Indian industry to go into these areas to invest. And I think I find that working with Singapore to go to all these countries is actually very, very good and very important for us as businesses. So this is what I see the really beneficial part of looking forward with Singapore. I think I was, we used to have a factory in Singapore, and many years ago, former Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong sort of, this is going back more than 10 years, said that, what are you doing? What are you making here? And he said, we are going to put up an industrial unit in Vietnam. And we're going to not just build a wonderful infrastructure like you have in Singapore, but we're going to give you something which you have never seen before anywhere else, which is the Singapore style of taking decisions in Vietnam. And this was, for me, was something quite amazing. And I experienced it. We became the first investor in the Singapore-Vietnam Industrial Park. And the whole idea there was that you have a social infrastructure of doing business the same as you do in Singapore. And I think that export that Singapore did to Vietnam is something that I look forward to Singapore doing in India. Because I think that these are the ways that when you have a good legal method of doing business, a stable way of doing business, an efficient way of doing business, how do you actually export that? How do you take that to other parts of the world? And I think that this was, for me, that was actually one of the greatest benefits and learnings I've had with working with Singapore over these last many years.
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting angle, that the major export from Singapore could be its way of
doing
making
business.
decision, doing business. Mr. Tomiko, would you like to come in at this point?
No,
He's going last.
He's going last, okay. Then let me turn to Ambassador Gopinath Pillai. He can really tell us something about this.
I'm not sure, but I'll try. I think to take it from where Jamshed left off, and that is, what can Singapore do to enhance the reach of India on a global scale? I would like to address that question. I think first, within ASEAN, I think Singapore has performed certain functions in the dialogue with ASEAN, and Singapore has been instrumental in India becoming a full sectoral dialogue partner of ASEAN. Somebody earlier on today asked the question, what happened in history? For 3,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, Southeast Asia was where Indian culture blossomed. India had a preeminent position. How did it lose it? And how is that now India is far behind countries like China? Now, this has got an economic aspect to it. So I thought I will address this problem. First and foremost, I think it is true, culturally, India had a preeminent position in Southeast Asia. Whether it is Thailand, whether it is Indonesia, whether it's Malaysia, even Vietnam, there was a very strong Hindu influence. Even Islam came through to Southeast Asia through India. Christianity came through India. So India was the conduit for bringing these things in. Now, what happened? One of the things that you must realize is that even though culturally India was preeminent, all these countries, almost without exception, and I think Tan Tai Yong is a good person to say whether I'm right or wrong, almost all these Southeast Asian countries paid tribute to China. They recognized China as a source, gave them, they had suzerainty over Southeast Asia. And China accepted Indian culture, not as a competing culture, but as a complementary culture. So trade flourished. The Chinese came to trade, the Indian traders came to trade. Today, if you are in Bhubaneswar, every year they celebrate something called Bali Yatra. This is journey to Bali, because that's where the trade started, from Kalinga Empire into Southeast Asia. So we had a long relationship with Southeast Asia. So had China. And they remained together in this area without any conflict whatsoever. Now, when you go back after a couple of thousand years, with the colonial powers having intervened, having chopped up the country, disrupted the natural flow of events, as it were, natural flow of the interaction, you have to rebuild this again. And it is not wise, you ask me, to do it on a confrontational basis, but do it on a collaborative basis. I think the Chinese would have no objection if the Indian culture flourished in Southeast Asia, as long as they have the feeling that they are preeminent political entity. Now, other countries may object to this. That's something that, but your preeminence comes from economic development. So India's concentration must be on building your economic infrastructure, your ability to sell your goods, your ability to buy and process the goods, your ability to reach the markets in timely fashion. And above all, you must build up a culture of integrity in politics, in economics. It is anybody can buy and sell goods, but the buyer has the confidence that what you sell is not, they are not being shortchanged, they are not being exploited, but they get money's worth. That is extremely important. So the economic aspect, where do we go from here? Meaning, where do Singapore and India go from here? I'm not trying to say that Singapore is the paragon of virtue. We have our own set of crooks. We deal with them in a very harsh manner when we catch them. But the law does not condone. You cannot go to a magistrate's court and get an injunction or a warrant against your competitor. That's not possible. The problem that you have sometimes is that in some of the other countries, and maybe India, the courts are sometimes influenced by who brings the case. And therefore, economic activity is retarded. You have to make sure that it flows, that people are not afraid to come here, invest money. They may lose their capital because of bad judgment. They may lose their money because of market turning against them. But they should not lose money because they have been cheated. That is not something that you should condone. So if there is one lesson that, I think lesson is a bad word, there is one aspect of our business practice in Singapore that you are to emulate. I would say it is to try and do things in a transparent manner, in a manner that gives confidence to your business partner. So I feel that going forward, if you take 20 years, 30 years back, the business environment in India was different. It has progressed. It has become much more acceptable. Mr. Kata and myself have been in business here for the last 20 years. And we have managed to manage the problems. So it is not impossible. From the side of Singapore, what they need to do is to be, I won't say adventurous, but to be proactive so that they take business opportunities. There was I don't think I'm revealing any secrets, but there was an offer a long time ago when Delhi airport was being built, that Singapore should build it. And Singapore said, no, we don't have the bandwidth to do it. The Mr. Lee that Mr. Desai mentioned and Jamshid mentioned, he came to know about it, that we rejected this offer to build, and he was very upset. The entire team was changed because he said, how can you, just because you were a little scared of some of the business practices, you don't take such a wonderful project. So Singapore must learn to manage, must learn to grab opportunities that come, that is of mutual benefit. Economic logic must prevail. The logic of law and order must prevail. And you must be able to push forward your business propositions in a regulated manner, in a calibrated manner, so it benefits everybody. So looking ahead, I would say that Both Singapore and India can benefit, but Singapore must set aside its prejudices or its averseness to risk, and India must learn to do business in a way internationally acceptable. That's what I have to say.
Thank you very much. There are two things from here. Raja, I'd like you to comment on the first one, which is the strong focus on economic relations. What about the political side, and what I'm sure you'll have to say. And later, I hope you'll all comment on the point which Ambassador Pillai made about the way we do business in India and why that is so important in terms of building this relationship. Raja.
Yeah. I think Tomiko has a rule which says never speak more than 3 points. 3 points. So we'll stick to 3 points because 3 points is easy to remember, easy to convey, and easy to take away. I think the main title of the discussion today is, look, India and Singapore, where do we go from here? In terms of ideas, in terms of the goals that we have defined, I mean, that destination is quite clear and can be expressed in the form of integration. How do you integrate the economy? So not just of Singapore, but of Southeast Asia and East Asia with that of India. Second is the architecture, which is about what kind of a political order do you construct in Southeast Asia and East Asia, and what role does India play in that architecture at a time when there are significant changes that are taking place in the global politics, some of which, Nitin, you referred to. The third goal, of course, is the question of security. That is, what does India do to contribute to the security of Singapore and Southeast Asia, Singapore and ASEAN, or Singapore and East Asia, at a time when there is a historic power shift, when there's a rising power of China, the relative decline of America, and a whole rejigging of the security order in East Asia. So essentially, these are the three goals that we know we have to reach, that is integration, architecture, and security. That brings me to the second point. I mean, that if you want to know where you're going, you should know where you're coming from. And if you just look back and see where we have come from, India and Singapore were very much part of a single system that dealt with economics, regional political order, and security. The idea that we were two different worlds, that South Asia and Southeast Asia were different, or that India and Singapore have had nothing to do with each other, is a consequence of our historic amnesia, because we've long lost our sense of our relationship with the Southeast Asia, with Singapore at the center. So I'm not talking about Rajaraja Chola and all that stuff. I'm talking about contemporary history where the founding of Singapore was by civil servants of the East India Company. When Sir Stamford Raffles set up Singapore in 1890, essentially saw it as an emporium of the East that will serve the interests of India, the undivided subcontinent, and its engagement with East Asia, that's essentially China. So in some senses, Singapore was the fulcrum or the conduit of trade between India and China, or if you want to call it undivided subcontinent and East Asia. So Singapore grew out of this attempt of a globalizing India that was taking place in the 19th century. Indian labor, Indian capital, Indian soldiers, Indian men and women moved across this frontier, essentially contributing to the building of Singapore. But I think what happened after that, of course, post-independence, we've tended to withdraw into ourselves. We consciously disconnected ourselves. It was not just we separated by accident, I mean, like in the Hindi movies. It was a conscious, self-conscious policy of India to de-globalize post-1947. So we severed our historic connections with Singapore and Southeast Asia consciously. And once you chose a model of inward orientation, of import substitution, of self-reliance, you're not interested in trade, so therefore Singapore falls off the map. But Singapore comes back into the map exactly at a time when you decide to re-globalize, starting in 1991. So the Lucas policy was not a divining at a definite moment, but it was a consequence of India's attempt to globalize. And once you looked outward and globalized, Singapore naturally falls as the location, as Jamshed was saying, puts you back into the situation. And the Lucas policy was also announced in Singapore. So therefore, the challenge of the last 20 years has been, how do we do this reintegration of India with East Asia? And I think there, Singapore is ready and willing. The problems are really on the Indian side. Whether it's trade integration, today the problems, India is still not ready. The rest of the region is moving very fast. So it's really, we have to decide how far and how fast are we ready to move on terms of integration with, not just with Singapore, but with the whole of East Asia. The second point about political order, the political order, it was again Singapore that drew us into this whole East Asia summit. I mean, the Singapore campaign for India's membership of the East Asia Summit when it was founded in 2005. Earlier, Singapore supported India's membership of the ASEAN Regional Forum, a full dialogue partner of the ASEAN. And I think it is that process that led us, India, into the thing. But today, Singaporeans are polite, they're not going to say it in front of public, certainly, that actually, today in the region, there is a deep angst that, look, is India really ready to play a role in shaping the architecture of the region? Is India ready to be an active participant in building a new order in Asia? Precisely at a time when you have the China's rise taking place, as some of our panelists said, how come China has dominated the region when India has had, as Professor Kishore Mahbubani was saying earlier in the day, India has had a 2,000-year lead, but today China's trade with Singapore is 5 times larger than that of India. China's presence in the region is overwhelmingly, outshines that of India. So I think we got to think for ourselves, what is it that is holding us back? Why is it that we can't get out of our shell? And when the region, unlike in many other parts of the world, the region is inviting us to play a larger role in constructing a new political order in East Asia, but it is India's demands in its own mind that keep us from playing that role. So therefore, that is going to be a challenge again, I think, for us in the region. And then lastly, about security. That the region has seen, if you see Asia today, 70 years ago when the World War came to an end, what triggered off India's own grand participation, 1 million Indian troops participated in the Second World War, was the fall of Singapore. The Indian garrison in Singapore, the day that fell, that was the beginning of the Japanese march towards Burma, towards the northeast of India, and then their capture of Andamans and setting up of an alternative government. Now, that context in which Indian army rolled back the influence of the Japanese and reconstituted the old order in East Asia. But after independence, there we completely wipe it off our memory, and we pull back, and we have nothing to do with the security of the region. But today, amidst the rise of China, there are growing maritime disputes. There is tension all across the seas. The region is looking towards India, that is India prepared to make some contribution, military security contribution to, they're not asking us to send our warships to go and fight the Chinese. They're not asking us to do, bring your guns and fight. What they're saying is that, look, are you ready to be around and be a part of creating a balanced structure in East Asia and the waters of East Asia? There again, I think we've been ambivalent, we've been hesitant. Now, this government has talked about an activist policy. There's still words, but I think the intention to doing more for the security of the region is there, but I think translating that intention of reclaiming historically Indian role in the region is going to take some time, but that's the direction we got to go. So let me conclude with a thought. If you think of Singapore and its relationship with India, a small city-state, its relationship to India. So when Raffles set up Singapore, he called it the Emporium of the East. That it was going to be a place for financial exchange, for trade, for goods, and that Singapore's concept today of a global city essentially is built on that vision. That idea that, look, India needs an outreach point where it can spread its capital, where it can spread its influence through a strong base in Singapore. On the security side, Singapore, you could call, under the Raj, was the eastern anchor of India's military footprint across the Indian Ocean. Today, if India wants to play a role in South China Sea, it needs significant military cooperation with Singapore so that we can reach out to South China Sea with Singapore as a staging point. Singapore is the first country that we signed a defense agreement way back in 2003, but I think the potentials are immense, and this need not be constructed in hostility to someone else. It is about producing that balance of power, producing that stability in East Asia's waters, that India can play that role, and that role can only be played in partnership, in a genuine, lasting, enduring partnership with Singapore.
Thank you. So his picture is that of a reluctant India, which is not moving more rapidly in all of these areas. Tommy, would you like to come in at this point?
I'm the shortest of the four people, and I think I should stand up so that people in the back can see me. Yeah? I don't have anything as profound to say to you as my predecessors, so I'm just going to tell you my story. I begin my story by telling you that I love India. Yeah. And that I have more faith in India than many of my Indian friends have in their own country. Yeah. Yes. I admire the Indian civilization. I think you're a great country. And I believe that in this century, India will once more be a great country and civilization of the world. So I just want to follow my wife's advice and limit myself to making 3 points. Point number one, I want to explain to you why you have a very special place in Singapore. History connects us. The British used to rule Singapore from Calcutta. And many of our laws were based upon Indian laws. Our penal code, our law of evidence, our administration of justice, the way public administration is organized, were all based upon Indian models. So there's a strong historical connection. But there's also a close people-to-people and cultural connection. For example, about 9% of our population, if I'm not wrong, are people who have emigrated to Singapore from the Indian subcontinent. We speak many Indian languages. We love Indian food. And your great religions, Hinduism, Sikhism, Jainism, are all practiced in Singapore and are part of the 10 great religions of the world that unite the Interreligious Organization of Singapore. Of all the countries in Southeast Asia, Singapore stands alone in that we are very proud of our Indian heritage. I think only in Singapore do you find an Indian Heritage Center. So the next time you visit Singapore, please come and visit this newly opened Indian Heritage Center in Little India. It is a token of our acknowledgement of the important contributions that our Indian forebears have made to Singapore, and an acknowledgement of our appreciation of Indian culture. My second point is that we have tried in the last several decades to build a strong, comprehensive, multi-dimensional relationship with India. And let me just briefly touch upon these different dimensions. Economically, the relationship between India and Singapore is very strong. I think we are your 5th largest trading partner, and you are our 11th largest trading partner. Singapore or Mauritius alternate in being the number 1 or number 2 foreign investor in India. And Indian companies have a very substantial investment in Singapore. So the economic relationship is very substantial. It is two-way. It's mutually beneficial. But our relationship is not just confined to business and economics. It has to do also with defense. The Indian Army, the Indian Air Force, the Indian Navy have bilateral cooperative relations with the Singaporean counterparts. We exercise together regularly. And because we have such a high comfort level, Singapore is the only foreign country which is allowed to exercise on Indian soil. Such is our high comfort level and mutual trust. Our relationship is not just business, economic, defense. It's also culture, and it's also people-to-people ties. So I would say this relationship that we have built between India and Singapore is strong, trouble-free, comprehensive, substantial, and it's mutually beneficial. And speaking on the side of Singapore, we have confidence that the new government of Prime Minister Narendra Modi will succeed in elevating the rate of growth of the Indian economy to 8 to 10%. And we intend to participate in this new growth. We want to help Prime Minister Modi realize his ambition of making India, of instead of looking east, acting east, of building 100 smart cities, of building a clean India. So we are invested in you. My third and final point is that we are living in a moment of history when the old global order and the old regional order are in a flux. We are living at a moment when the old order is beginning to give way to a new order. Nobody knows, including our smartest colleague Kishore Mahbubani knows, what kind of a new order we will have. But what I know is that India has a very important role to play in the evolution of this new order. We in Singapore regard you as a benign great power. We want you to be at the table. This is why Singapore works so hard to persuade ASEAN to have a dialogue relationship with India, and then to bring India into ASEAN Regional Forum, and then to bring India into the East Asia Summit. We do all this because it's in our national interest. We regard you as a benign major power, that you have a positive contribution to the evolution of a new regional order in Asia and in the Asia Pacific. And so we're helping you in order to help ourselves. Yeah. We have confidence in you, India, so please don't fail us. Have faith in yourself. Believe in yourself. Believe in yourself that you can overcome many challenges that you've inherited from the past. Believe in yourself that it is possible for India to grow 8 to 10% for the next decade and more. Believe in yourself that you can move successfully from a low-income country to a middle-income country and eventually to a high-income country. Believe in yourself that in the 21st century, India can at long last overcome its legacy of the past and become a modern, fully developed country. Thank you.
Let me get some reactions. Radha, would you like to comment on the last point about the role that India can play in the evolution of a regional security and political architecture, and the fact that that Singapore is very keen on bringing India in, and that it's perhaps India which has been the reluctant player?
Look, I think the region has been ready. The stage has been set. It is for the bridegroom to show up. Now, the problem with the bridegroom doesn't show up. There are Shangri-La meeting that takes place every year in Singapore, where whole of Asian defense establishments come there, but our defense minister finds it very hard to fit it into his schedule. It's one hotel you can meet 30 defense delegations from across Asia. It doesn't fit. Mr. Anthony didn't have time to show up at ASEAN defense ministers meeting. So I think on the trade issue, we are very reluctant now negotiator in the regional comprehensive economic partnership. So I think the challenge is not, there's no other region which is as welcoming of India, you heard it directly from Ambassador Tomiko, as welcoming of as India need to succeed and become a great power. So it's really within our minds, because what we've seen in the last 25 years, we had frequent bouts of a sense, look, India is a rising power, it can play a larger role, therefore look east policy. But in operational terms, you keep pulling back. So there is this one step forward, two steps back kind of a thing that's gone on constantly. But I think as a weight in the process has actually grown as the 7th or 8th largest economy, with the 4th largest armed force, with the 8th largest spender on defense. It's a question of how do you bring these resources into synergy with what the region is asking for and what India actually believes it can do in the future.
But what is holding back? What is it that's holding back? Is there some issue with respect to relations with other countries?
No, I think there is. You had the lingering residual legacy of, and I'm going to be attacked for this, but of non-alignment of strategic autonomy, where actually, if you see yourself as a weak power trying to limit what others do to you, if you start thinking, look, you are the 3rd largest economy, at least in PPP terms, how long are you going to be pretending to be a third world country? That your capabilities today, material, overall, aggregate capabilities, give you the opportunity to play a role. It is the gap between your material capabilities that have emerged, even during a relatively slow period of growth of the last 25 years, and your political discourse, which remains trapped in the past. So the ideas of an inward protectionist economy or of a strategic autonomy will continuously limit and prevent you from playing a larger role. So I think that's where the challenge is. But my sense is the present government is talking about India wanting to become a leading power. It's talking about acting east. It has the seeds of a more productive policy, but I'm keeping my fingers crossed.
On another point, Jamshid, I don't know whether you want to comment on what Master Gopinath Pillai was saying about the Singapore way of doing business and the importance of trying to understand that. And do you think, I thought that you had also in one way referred to it when you referred to your Vietnam experience. What are, in more practical terms, what is it that we can do? Or do you think that the atmosphere for foreign enterprises in India has changed or improved, worsened? What has happened in the past few years?
Well, I think there's no doubt that the economic climate for everybody, foreign investors and Indian investors, has improved significantly in India. I think that this government's thrust on doing business and the ease of doing business, how we may be having far too many rules and regulations which are not relevant for today's business needs, is I think, a very important aspect, So there is an attempt to do that. I think our main issue, if I can put it, is the legacy issues. We've had, I think that right from day one, the whole idea was the primacy of the public sector. The private sector was never given the same opportunities that the public sector had. I think that the labor law regulations and milieu was at a time when all the trade unions were political trade unions. They weren't business trade unions. So the regulation was all around that. So I think these legacy issues we have to dismantle one by one. But if we do it, I don't see the entrepreneurial ability of Indian entrepreneurs to take advantage of that is very, very high. So I think that the huge opportunities we know in defense, clearly the private sector was kept out of it. Today they are being asked to be part of it. So I think like that, I think we have to learn. I think if we are able to overcome some of these legacy issues in a very measured way, and we are actually able to show that the way of doing business has changed, then I think that you will see a huge amount of investment coming in. And I think that one of the reasons why, obviously Ram is here, he's done a fantastic job with TCS, and the service sector, grew at a time when there was clearly huge opportunity in the world for it to grow and didn't have the same type of legacy issues that the manufacturing sector had. And that made a huge difference to India's ability to project itself.
Absolutely.
So I think that today, the huge amount of respect that India gets and for innovation and for, the reason why you see so many Indian professionals around the world, is I think, to a lot to do with the fact that we were able to show ability through the services sector. We have to do the same thing in manufacturing. I think that, if we are not able to do that, we will never be able to absorb the difference. You heard that at lunchtime, the difference between creating 2 million jobs and 20 million people coming to the job market every year. I mean, there's no other way aside from manufacturing.
Exactly.
Services, definitely, I mean, it will grow, there's no doubt about it. And also, I always recall the late C.K. Prahlad. He used to always tell us this, that India's strength of services, together with a strength in manufacturing, can be unbeatable in the world. Right. So we have to develop that strength of manufacturing. And it's not that we don't have strong manufacturing units in India, but I think we just have to strengthen it a lot more and also be able to attract people to come to India to set up businesses for manufacturing for the world, the way that China was able to do. And I think if we are able to do that, I think we'll see a huge difference in, but there's no doubt in my mind to your question that things are better, despite everything that you may want to listen to and hear on television, talk shows. Things are definitely better, and they are moving in the right direction, which I think is clearly the difference that you see today in India's ability to address these issues.
Can I just ask you a slightly different question? Because yes, in many ways, a big city like Singapore has to have some concept of what constitutes its hinterland. Like, say, for Hong Kong, its hinterland is mainland China. Do we, as India, figure in your conception of what is the hinterland around which your global city is being thriving?
The answer is very simple. The world is our hinterland. We manufacture for export, not to the region, but to the world. We attract investors not just from the region, from the world. So our vision of ourselves is that we are a global city, we are a global economy. We provide, and by the way, in the early years of our economic development, we worked very hard to create from zero a manufacturing sector. So, Jamshid, you're absolutely right. India cannot fulfill its ambition if you don't succeed in creating a major manufacturing sector. Yeah. Only a manufacturing sector can create the kind of jobs that you need for your young people. And you must have a balanced economy. Economy cannot be just services. You need a balanced economy. Germany and Switzerland are the two models that we should follow. Yeah. And those economies have a very balanced economy. You look at Switzerland, over 25% of the GDP of Switzerland still comes from manufacturing, in spite of the high cost. Because they have highly skilled people, they are innovative, they are creative. So this is our role model.
Let me open the floor now. General Saab. General Chopra. General Chopra.
Thank you, Chair.
I know some of you, but so I happen to know him. So, but
Anyway,
please introduce yourself.
I'm a happy platinum veteran of 4 wars. With a stint with TCS, my colleague is here, Ram. On this legacy business, a slight observation, then my intervention. We are no longer non-aligned. We moved multi-alignment with special relationships. That's going to help us to get out of this legacy business. We won't worry so much about China and the Far East and the South China Sea and Afghanistan as far as Pakistan is concerned. Okay. Now, what I want to know from Singapore, Xi Jinping has propounded this maritime and this Silk Route, the one belt, one road business. Since you're a hub, which has been brought out by all the panelists, how are you going to maximize this concept of Xi Jinping as far as you're concerned? Because in India, I find we're still not enthusiastic enough. We're still going to do it through the Act East. Modi's on his way back, so no longer look east, that's Act East. And look west. And we're looking at the literal. Can we do something together to gain out of this idea of Xi Jinping? Thank you, Chairman.
Would you like to collect a few, or would you like to? Well, let's collect a few, maybe, because Then there are lots of hands up. The gentleman just behind General Chopra, and then yes, then we'll go to the back.
I have two small questions to Ambassador.
Please introduce yourself.
Introduce yourself.
I'm Alok Bansal from India Foundation.
India Foundation.
There's a mic there.
RSI, India Foundation.
First question to Ambassador Tomiko. While talking about the religions, you talked of Hinduism, Jainism, Sikhism. Was Buddhism omitted by design? That's an important question which I wanted to know. The second issue is, of course, to Raja, who talked of the reluctant bridegroom. Singapore and Malaysia have been part of FPDA, five-part defense.
How can I forget Buddhism? Because
That's why I said
the
left out. That's why
the
I said.
largest religion in Singapore is
That's why I
Buddhism.
said.
But I also
Probably you didn't consider it Indian. That's what I said.
no, but I also know very few Indians who are Buddhists. I think Amartya Sen may be the only Buddhist I know in India.
No, the second question is to Raja. He talked about the reluctant bridegroom. We still have the relic of the Cold War era, that is FPDA. We have a five-part defense agreement of which Singapore is still a partner. Defense alliances, even if they're not aimed against it, they create certain apprehensions. Now, what is FPDA aimed against? Because one has grown up with Indian ships being shadowed by aircraft
not a
of
member of
FPDA taking
FPDA.
off and
Why
shadowing
does he
them.
say that?
Now, is India likely to be accepted as part of FPDA? Or when you are talking of long-term relationship between India and Singapore?
The gentleman there at the back and then here. Let's take about 3 or 4 questions and then respond. We have time, don't worry. We have enough time for all of you.
My name is Syed Hashimi. I'm from Houston, Texas, and I lived in New York City. I believe you were in Queens for a long time, Ambassador. But my question is about manufacturing and also bringing the solar cells from Singapore and manufacturing solar panels in India and exporting to the United States. Is there a possibility of an alignment here because China's panels are being taxed in U.S.? We are considering such a route for solar panels.
That's a sort of very, very precise business question. Let's see whether we can handle it. Yes, can you give the mic here to this gentleman here? And then.
I'm Anup Bose. I'm a senior advocate at the Supreme Court of India and an advisor to Tata Consultancy Services. Dr. Rajamohan talked about the amnesia and then referred to 1991 and then went on to the aspect of military security of the region. Mr. Godrej talked very aptly about the manufacturing sector. And Mr. Koh did go on to the aspect of treating India as a benign economic power. Now, of course, we have not been suffering
You use the
from
phrase benign great power.
amnesia, and I will come to that, and I'll come to my questions. You see, even after the fall of Singapore and the advent of the Indian National Army, you know, Subhash Bose gave the Delhi Chalo call from Singapore, from the stadium. Then Nehru, who influenced your minister, mentor, whom I had the privilege of meeting. Then the first Indian Jewish chief minister, Mr. Marshall from Bombay. Then Mr. Narasimha Rao, I used to stay with him. I knew how important Singapore was to him. To Mr. Modi. Now, coming to Mr. Modi, that's where you all come in. How do you propose to strengthen his Make in India campaign now that things have changed? And is Mr. Koh prepared to walk the extra mile and treat India as a malignant economic power?
I said, what? Malignant?
Full of economic strength in terms of malignancy.
Malignant.
Malignant, from a benign power to a malignant power.
Anyhow, there's a particular way of using the term malignant. The gentleman here has been waiting for some time.
Malignant.
And let's stop there, then we'll come back.
Thank
We
you
have
very
time.
much, Chairman. It has been very wonderful, enlightening, and insightful. My concerns are that most important is, can India learn about sustainable lifestyles? You have talked about India becoming a high income from a low income to middle income and to high income. But looking at the ecological dimensions, I feel that sustainable lifestyles are very crucial. And are there lessons? What learning can India get from that? Because if we follow Singapore's pattern of consumptions and production, I think India will again get into a very big abyss, a black hole. So we need to look at our culture, but we need to look also at the value system of being, of contentment, of a sustainable pattern of living, and also harmony with nature around us. Singapore perhaps may not have so much of a natural environment that we have in India, but then if we don't teach our younger generation now, then we will be again on the high road of materialism, and that kind of consumption will only lead to disasters.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm A.K. Merchant, trustee of the Baha'i Lotus Temple.
May I ask you to start with that question on the sustainability of consumption, which I know you have a strong interest in this area.
I don't know whether you know that Nitin and I spent 2.5 years of our life in the preparatory committee for the 1992 Earth Summit. Yeah? So, and I had the pleasure of chairing the negotiations in Rio. So I'm a believer. I'm a believer. There is a crisis in the world because the Western patterns of production and consumption do not lead to a sustainable world. And the challenge for all of us in the world, and not just in Asia, is whether we can turn away from that model, which is not sustainable, to a new model, a model in which we generate much less carbon. I mean, can we make a transition to a low-carbon economy? Can we rely less on fossil fuel and much more on renewable? Can we recycle more? Can we consume less? Can we recycle water? Because we're living in a world short of water. I recommend a book to you. A colleague of mine at the university, his name is Prasenjit Dwara, has just published a wonderful book called The Crisis of Modern Sustainability. Yeah? And I completely agree with Prasenjit that Asia can either save the world or Asia will ruin the world, because growth is going to happen here. And if we simply continue along the path of our Western brothers and sisters, we will ruin the world. But if we can come up with a new model, then we can save the world. I believe that one can live with material sufficiency and dignity without ruining the earth. Yeah, that's my belief. Let me just answer two more questions.
Yes, absolutely.
There's a question about Xi Jinping's two proposals. One is to revive the overland Silk Road, and the other is to revive the maritime Silk Road. He calls it the 21st century maritime Silk Road. Many friends in the West are very skeptical about these two proposals. They think that these two proposals have a strategic intent, and the strategic intent is to build a new China-centric world. They believe that these proposals have a strategic intent, and the strategic intent is to escape from what the Chinese perceive as an American encirclement of China and an attempt by the United States to contain the rise of China. I take no position on whether these Western views are right or wrong. I take the Chinese proposal on its face value. And I'm helping to organize in Singapore on the 27th of July a one-day forum on the 21st century maritime Silk Road. I'm inviting a very senior Chinese official to give the keynote address, to explain to us, what have you got in mind? How does it benefit the region? But I'm also inviting thought leaders from regional countries to come to the forum. And they include my good friend Raja Mohan. It includes a very good friend of mine in Jakarta, who's the deputy minister, deputy coordinating minister in charge of maritime affairs, Ambassador Havas Egrosono. I'm inviting somebody from Korea, who's a judge of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, I'm inviting somebody from Vietnam, a woman who's a brilliant international lawyer. So I think all of us in the region need to get together, and discuss consensually what is in this Chinese proposal and how can we make this proposal benefit all of us. If the idea is to bring about greater connectivity between the islands and ports of the region, I'm all for it. If the idea is to enhance the maritime infrastructure of the region, I'm all for it. If the idea is to enhance maritime trade, I'm all for it. So I'm not prejudiced against President Xi's proposal. I have not made up my mind on whether it's a good thing or not, pending the outcome of the forum that I'm organizing in Singapore on the 27th of July. On FPDA, I don't think you got your facts right, So let me just explain what FPDA means. FPDA means Five Power Defense Arrangements. Yeah? Singapore used to be Britain's most important base for its army, air force, and navy. Because of the downturn in the British economy, the Labour government decided in 1972 that it will close down these bases, And it was a tremendous trauma for us because 20% of our economy depended on British expenses in these bases. It was a tremendous blow for us, having just been expelled from Malaysia, to have 30,000 people lose their jobs. It was a real blow for us. Now, and people also wondered whether without British protection, they would be vulnerable. So the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, and Singapore entered into a five-power defense arrangement. It is not like NATO. There's no obligation to defend each other in the event of attack. But it is some confidence building. It is confidence building. It served its purpose, with the loss of the British bases, it sort of reassured the people of Malaysia and Singapore that they are not left alone, that they have friends, that in the event of trouble, the British, the Australians, and New Zealand, fellow Commonwealth countries, will be around to help us. But the FPDA is a creature of its time. It served a specific purpose, and it would make no sense for India to now apply to join the FPDA.
Raja.
I think 2 points. I think on the Silk Road, General Chopra, you asked the question, thank you. Because the whole day, our Singaporean friends were asking me, or asking the Indians, what is your view of the Silk Road? Do you have an idea? Do you have a counter? What do you propose to do about this great initiative? And why is India ambivalent about it? So I think everyone in the region is trying to cope with this idea. And you saw the Prime Minister in China, I think he's half in, half out. He supported the land corridor, at least the BCIM, which is the Bangladesh, China, Myanmar, India corridor. Not very supportive of the Maritime Silk Road. But I think the fact is, look, we have not defined a position. We joined the AIIB, which is going to finance all these projects. We are a member of it. But we're not sure what it's going to do. So I think there is a problem. The fact is this, that the Chinese have the resources and excess industrial capacity to dramatically expand connectivity in the region. India needs connectivity. Do you take advantage of it? Or are you going to view this purely from a geopolitical perspective? There, I think China is not the only one which is talking about connectivity. The Japanese are very interested. They have their own ideas of how to connect Southeast Asia and India. The Americans have talked about an Indo-Pacific corridor. So I think this is not a threat. This is not a geopolitical conspiracy. I think this is an opportunity for India to use its capacities to build connectivity and strengthen itself. Second, I think on the question of FPDA, I met an Indian. Alok, congratulations. You are the first one who's heard of this FPDA. And you are even frightened by it. That's even shocking for me. Great Britain, now some people call it Little England, doesn't have enough ships to send it across to the Southeast Asia. New Zealand became really liberal, so they almost abolished their armed forces. That takes care of 2 members. Then Australia, of course, has other problems. So that leaves poor Singapore and Malaysia. So if you're frightened by this arrangement, so there is, I think we should get over this colonial business, because I think this constant chip on our shoulder of not seeing things in a historical perspective. The Chinese and the Americans fought a war in the Korean Peninsula, 1950 to 53, thousands of casualties. 18 years later, the Chinese and the Americans are on the same side fighting the Russians, 71. You had Vietnam fought the Americans, great anti-imperialist war. Today, the Americans and the Vietnamese are the biggest buddies of how do you deal with the Chinese military power. Philippines and Vietnam are under the occupation of Japan. Yes. Today, they're looking to Japan to support them militarily against China. That's where we are. So to put in this colonial way of thinking, you don't respond. So there's no reply. Like all good, the phone call never gets returned. So the phone call never got returned to Singapore. And I think that is where our abdication of a role that we could have played. Today, I think they're looking to you because you can actually play that role. And no one is asking you to come and fight. The question is, are we prepared to engage the region? Are we ready to attend meetings? Are we ready to hold hands and meet people and do things together?
Would you like to respond? No. Shall we wait for a few more questions? Come. You can open the... Yes, Suresh, come.
Thank you very much. Suresh Goel, retired ambassador. Ambassador Tomiko and everyone else here, a bit of a preface. My diplomatic career in the Indian services began in 1980 with my posting to Singapore. And therefore, I've seen Singapore grow, and I've seen ASEAN grow. My one remark, and a bit of an explanation, is to what Raja said, the Indian bridegroom not being ready to be courted or to go to Southeast Asia or ASEAN. The problem is that not all the 10 brides think in the same manner. There are differences of opinion amongst all of them. I have participated in several track 2 discussions. And I think, and I would like to have a reaction to that from Ambassador Gopi Pillai and Tomiko on this thing. My own concern is that the way things are at the moment, even if India wishes to go into Southeast Asia with a kind of a political architecture or the security architecture that rather you talked about, we might actually become part of a power contest in which there'll be nobody on our side, with the exception of Singapore, of course. Singapore has been a good friend all the time. Maybe one or two, maybe just one more I can think of. But there'll be nobody else who actually, they will all want to be away from that power context. And then where do we stand? Thank you.
Good, that's interesting. Yes, that gentleman there at the back, and then, oh, fine. We'll take all 3 of you. Come.
Thank you. My name is Nalin Kohli. I had the privilege of leading a IT delegation to Singapore just about a month ago. The sense I get, despite the close relationship, common legal system, is that we haven't even scratched the surface as far as the synergies that are possible. Just to give you an example, Mr. Godrej mentioned about our success in services, particularly IT services. So we do more than $100 billion of IT export. Almost 70% is to North America, 20% to Europe, 10% to rest of the world. Now here is where Singapore and India have a synergy. We can work together and do things which India has a strength in. Even non-IT services like legal, education, whole lot of services where India can be good at, but probably there would be synergy in working with Singapore. So my first question is that we can work together on some of these areas where India has a proven strength today. And as far as this regional cooperation is concerned, maybe we are not as good as China in terms of building roads or building ports, but in terms of IT superhighways, we may be better. So we may have to relook at how we can help our neighbors and how we can have a newer, different relationship.
Raja, there's a question to you. My name is Atul Ponj.
Atul?
Ponj. To my mind, our ability to really expand internationally comes from the strength of our core. if we continue to be embarrassed about what we have in the country and everything is talked about future potential, whether it is infrastructure, whether it is power generation, whether it is sports, whether it is defense preparedness, we always are talking about the demand and making it sound like it's a very sexy number. Okay, $1 trillion for infrastructure, $500 billion for defense. Everything is out in the future. What is it that what needs to happen for our bureaucracy within the country to really wake up and say that unless we are confident about what we have achieved inside, okay, only then can we really project our authority and power outside. I disagree fully with my colleague earlier who mentioned that China is better at building roads. Almost all the infrastructure in the Middle East has been built by Indian companies, okay, and continues to be built. We, for example, have an investment in Singapore where we are building out a large amount of the infrastructure to global standards. It's an environment, it's an enabling environment that the Chinese have because of government financing that allows them to go many steps ahead of Indian companies. So this embarrassment coupled with the fear of the past, like you said, the colonial hangover, that earlier you were scared of the CIA, everything was blamed on the CIA, then it was blamed on some other imaginary power, to give excuses as to why we have to close everything down. Then became the fear of the private sector. It was a bad world to make money. Taxation was ridiculous. We're always apologetic about what we really are all about. But when we go out of India, all right, we all seem to flourish, whether it's Indians in Singapore, whether it's Indians in the West, okay, we seem to flourish in an environment simply because we are unshackled. There's no other reason. If the services sector has managed to explode, it was because they had an environment that was free. So what is it that will happen to really make the government wake up or the bureaucracy wake up? There is definitely moves happening in some parts, but other parts, very little action and the desire to hold on to authority, hold on to power, keep the shackles on. You know, there is a clear bias still towards the public sector. So what will be needed, what needs to happen for that to change? Because unless that happens, I think we'll be all in a dialogue, always talking about future, what could be, what will be, what has to happen, how many, this 20 million employment number I've been hearing now for the last 7 years, right? We're still pretty much in the same place that we were 7 years ago. The $1 trillion I've been hearing about, we're still hearing about it today.
Many, many thanks. So I think what you're suggesting may suggest to me it is probably better if the bureaucracy goes to sleep rather than wakes up. Anyhow, come, Vandana.
Thank you, sir. Sarvjit Dudeja, my name. Professor Ko, we are very much impressed with your encouraging words of believe in yourself and the way you have encouraged Indians' economy and other things. My question is simple. The way our politics is very much antagonistic, the way Jamshed pointed out about manufacturing, without support of opposition, how can we progress? The land acquisition bill is a big issue. I don't think anything can happen without this type of political collaboration. How we are going to deal this type of situation?
Can you take one more question and then we can, how do I choose? Come. You decide. There is a microphone. Please introduce yourself.
I'm General Lamba. I was the Vice Chief of Indian Army, the small Indian Army of 1.1 million. My question is, in the realms of security, and my perception is, and I fully back what Dr. Rajamohan said, power politics today is not to get worried about, like many just mentioned. Do you stay out of it, or do you get into it and play a role? I think that's the big difference that we've been avoiding. If we do this, somebody will get, China will get worried, or Pakistan will get worried, and we haven't got into Pakistan. And the simplest lesson we draw is, India may well be out of Afghanistan, with China guiding and Pakistan playing a role. If that's the example, it's a lesson for the others to stay. When it comes to national security integration, India can no longer afford to stay out of it. You've got to get into it. Same is the case with India and Singapore. I think there's a lot of cooperation, both strategically required and also in the Make in India concept. And I'm coming down to the economic fallout of what I'm going to say. Singapore Technologies got blacklisted a few years back by an overcautious domain that was there. The kind of weapon systems they were giving to India were phenomenal, but they got blacklisted forever and they still haven't come out of it. There are many more technologies in Singapore which can come to India at much cheaper price, at much easier regulations, but nobody talks about it. Everybody's looking at the West, the US, UK, and the Central Europe. So I think if nobody else is looking at it, if we feel, and I'm a security man, served in the army for 41 years, been to Singapore several times, and I have always got phenomenally impelled to think, why is it that there is not enough defense, integration, and manufacturing and cooperation between India and Singapore? That's a thought I want to leave with you, sir.
Okay, can we take up, would you like to take this last question up first on the, the greater integration on defense between India and Singapore?
I think Tommy...
I'm not a defense person, sir. So maybe Raja can...
Raja?
No, I think...
Look, you're a security man. We're all economists.
Like all good questions, the answers were in the question themselves. I mean, I think the problem for the last many years, I mean, the way our defense system is structured, whether it is the civil-military relationship, whether it is the nature of the procurement systems that are created, or the military diplomacy that has largely been de-emphasized for the last many years. So I think at least last 1 year, at least there's some attempt at reform, but by no means comprehensive. But at least I think we're beginning to look at it. Our private sector is beginning to come in. So I think there is some attempt at reconstituting the defense policy, but I think it has to go much further. But at the same time, I think you also need to do a greater self-confidence in engaging the rest of the world. Hopefully, we are on a different direction at this point. But I think at this point, of course, you can only hope. But I think what we've seen in the last 1 year gives reason for some optimism that finally some change is going to come the way our systems are organized. On your question, look, I mean, this is not my area. I mean, I don't deal with the domestic. I mean, but as you said, look, the problems finally are with us. The star, what is it Shakespeare said about the fall, dear Brutus? It's not in our stars, but it's in your internal reform. You made a start in 1991 saying we're going to change. But the change has been too slow, too incremental, and too hesitant. And there are constant flip-flops that have gone on for the last 25 years. And the problem is the rest of the world is moving on. I think that is going to be our biggest challenge. You see, it's not how much money you get. Look, if you have a good environment, money will come on its own. So therefore, when the Prime Minister says, I'll improve the ease of doing business in India, if you can do that actually, you don't need to ask anyone. Somebody said, look, how can Singapore help? Look, people are ready to put their money in. The question is, what is the environment we're willing to create? The bigger challenge, I think, like on the trade negotiations today with Singapore, with the ASEAN, the rest of the world and the kind of things they want to do on economic integration and what your Commerce Ministry or even your private sector is willing to accept today, the gap between the two is going to be, has steadily increased. And the longer you take to catch up, the more the danger that you might get left out. So we're not part of the RCEP. We are part of the RCEP, but I don't know if we are really part of the RCEP. That everyone thinks we are there to block it rather than to help negotiate it. TPP, nobody wants to touch us. So I think you are caught in this situation. So that's why I think if you don't move quickly enough of how you do business at home, forget the rest of the world. If you get your internal act together, the rest of it will follow. And I think Manmohan Singh used to say very often, look, the world wants India to do well. Modi is saying the same thing. The question is, do you have the capacity to say exactly the number of problems you listed, and can we overcome them?
Whenever non-businessmen talk about business, it always looks rosier. The actual fact is, while we can talk about manufacturing being the solution for your job problem, or creating, ease of business, the most important thing is you got to build an ecosystem. It's a multifaceted thing. Just saying that, okay, we relax the rules, that's only the beginning. There are many things. First, if you are going into manufacturing, the land problem has been, beaten to death, but that's a serious problem. Power shortage, the provision of power, interest costs, skilled labor, the market identification. There's a multiple, faceted problems that you need to tackle before you go into this. So it is not something that's going to happen tomorrow. It is changing it over a period of time. I think connecting it with something the gentleman who was in Singapore before, he talked about whether it is wise, it is appropriate for India to look at the entire group of ASEAN or individual countries. I think he touched on a very, very good point, because ASEAN is not what it used to be. As I said earlier in the morning, there are outside players in ASEAN dictating its space. So India goes in. India has to tread very carefully and make sure what is of benefit to India, and then go according to that. India's main job should be to build up its economy. China did that. China is now raising its voice, raising its profile, because it has performed. It has built itself a position where its reserves go into trillions of, actual trillions, not the trillions that I hear talked about here, but this is actual $1 trillion of reserves. So they can afford to talk in certain ways. It is better that India takes a profile where it builds its economy, it builds an ecosystem which allows economic development to take place. It needs to be attacked from various angles, and then you can probably, in a period of 2 to 3 decades, you get to a position where China is today.
Ambassador Koh, so final remarks?
I want to answer your question first. You said that the 10 ASEAN countries don't always agree. That is true. But we have in ASEAN a culture by which we are able to consult one another and eventually arrive at a consensus. There is this very strong culture in ASEAN of arriving at consensus. As far as India is concerned, ASEAN is a one mind. We want India to be our partner. There's no division within ASEAN about wanting India to be our partner. Our complaint against you is that we've given you a seat at the table, but you are very often not contributing. For example, in the current negotiation, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, the sense is that you are not being proactive, but you are being defensive. Yeah? And this leads me to a more general point. And I want to make the point with which I began this afternoon. You must have confidence in yourself. It is time for India to discard your old mindset of a poor developing country. It is time for you to discard the mindset that you are always playing defense, protecting your defensive interests. It's time for you to be proactive and to have offensive interests. When you come to a negotiation, you should have a list of what you want to achieve instead of a list of what you want to protect. This requires a mindset change we have not seen. Yeah. And Indian bureaucrats seem to be caught in a time warp. They're still behaving as if they were working for India of 30 years ago than India of the 21st century. So my plea to you is, please have confidence in yourself. You can compete in the world. Great Indian companies have shown that you can compete in the world. The world has opened its arms to welcome India. It is now time for you, India, to open your arms and welcome the world.
I want to say a few words. Anyhow, we have to end because they have a very interesting conversation ahead of them. As you know, the new capital of Simandra is going to be built in collaboration with Singapore, and we will be talking to Mr. Chandrababu Naidu, and we have to make sure that we get up there in time. So I'm afraid I have to call a halt to this. Let me just say in conclusion, it's very interesting that we should be having this conversation almost exactly 70 years after the Asian Relations Conference. This was one of the first exercises. Yeah, this was one of the first exercises in foreign policy that the government was going to take over in August, an undertaking. And it played a major role in the freedom movements in the entire Asian region. That was a time when India was fully engaged in the rest of Asia. And that, incidentally, let me just tell you, there is an exhibition on the Asian Relations Conference right now in the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. I happen to be on the executive council of that, so that's a little bit of a sales plug. But do go and see it if you can. But it is it is in a way paradoxical that when we were so actively engaged in Asian relations at the dawn of independence, we slowly lost that for a variety of reasons. We have no choice but to get engaged now in Asia. That's where the future economic growth of the world will come from. That's where the battle for sustainability has to be won and lost. And that's where some of the key potential strategic issues of the future lie. So there is no choice for us except to be fully engaged with the rest of Asia in whichever way we think prominent. The one message I get from all of them is that the real problem is India is a reluctant bridegroom. That it wants to be there, but is not sure what it wants from its engagement. And perhaps that is what we need to do, that we need to do much more of soul searching ourselves. We did have some discussion on the economic side, and things are moving very much in the direction which, in terms of ease of doing business, the Singapore model, etc. And Singapore as a base for India's political as well as economic opening to Asia is something which we heard about from our very distinguished panelists. But I'm very grateful to them for joining us here, and I'm sure that the messages will be heard by many of the people here and will be taken home. Thank you very much, everybody. You've been very good as an audience.